Hello, folks. We are now live. How's everybody doing today? Also, let me know if my audio is at all wonky. I just got back from San Diego last night, flying in, and I had a bit of congestion, so my ear's still a little clogged up. So I don't really know exactly how loud I am. Let me know if I need to be louder or if I'm shouting at y'all. I think I'm fine, but I don't. I don't know if I'm fine. So I'm relying on you to let me know where we're at. How's everybody doing? Just gonna hang out for a minute, let other folks pile in here over time as they do, and then we'll dive into these lovely, lovely lessons, talking about zones and then going into game structure. Good morning, Curse Strife. Hello, Nilram. I started saying your name and just put that N right in the middle of hello. We're wide awake. Wide awake. Anybody have any fun events this past weekend? Play any fun games? Anything like that? I was at TwitchCon, which was a very strange experience for me. Most of the gaming shows that I go to, most of the events that I go to are very dedicated to tabletop gaming. Particularly, I generally just go to card game tournaments. Like I go to large Magic tournaments, sometimes large SWU tournaments, and all that's happening in the hall is people playing the game, and then some vendors, and then some artists, and that's about it. This Honda was there, which was weird. AT&T had a booth right across from us. They were doing something. It was even like general gaming conventions like Gen Con or SDCC. Those still have like this tabletop vibe, and this did not have a tabletop vibe. Surprisingly, Twitch.tv, not a tabletop vibe. The tabletop area was fantastic. We had Magic in one area. We had just some like living room setups with like couches and comfortable chairs and like coffee tables for people to play board games from the board game library. And we had RPG demos. It was a really great atmosphere over there. Curse Strife says, started tracking the winning leaders at our LGS this last weekend like we discussed in Tampa. Response was very positive. That's awesome. That's something that I want to put together like a little primer for, to just like give that idea out to other folks. So what Curse Strife is talking about is creating more thematic and narrative opportunities for players in your store. In particular here, tracking like when a player shows up, you just say, hey, what leader are you on? Even for like weekly play, any event. Like it's not for deck checking, it's not for verification purposes. But it's like, which leader's seeing the most play, right? And we know that it's going to be Boba. But you spin that into a narrative. So right now, Boba's daimyo of Curse Strife's store, right? Or like, the villains are winning the battle and this is an outpost for the bounty hunters. And you can take just a small amount of data and turn it into a narrative experience. And then for weekly play, somebody's like, well, I don't care too much about winning. I want to win, obviously. Who doesn't want to win? But I really don't want Boba to win. So I'm just going to show up with just a heroic leader because I want to play a heroic leader. Or I want to play villainous leader because the Empire needs more support, or I want to make sure Darth Maul gets his rightful place on the throne ruling the galaxy, or at least this tiny outpost. And that's something that I want to encourage, this sort of thematic and narrative play. Because it allows players who aren't as competitive to engage with the broader community in a way. There's the distinction in the tournament documents, the tournament regulations, of casual and competitive. And this is something that Tim and I have talked about a fair amount. Somebody that Tim knows plays Star Wars Unlimited on what we would call a very casual level. Like, has one deck. It doesn't even doesn't have three of the key legendaries to make it a very functional deck. It's just a Darth Maul themed deck. And so you'd be like, oh yeah, casual player, doesn't go to competitive events, isn't a competitive player. But I would hesitate to call them a casual player, because this player also has full Darth Maul face tattoos. Not face makeup, not like they apply a quick little bit of makeup before they go out to events, but permanently, indelibly etched onto their skin Darth Maul face tattoos, and they're getting titanium implants in their skull to have horns so they can match Darth Maul. And I wouldn't call that a casual player, because they like Darth Maul a lot. And so giving them an opportunity to represent their leader and to have fun with it allows these players who aren't as competitively minded to have more of an impact on the community, which I think is a very good thing. You went with a points per win system with an extra point for the overall day's winner. Had Sabine and Ray with 4 points, and Sabine with the overall win, and the leader to beat for next week. I love that. And shout outs to the players in the LGS Discord. That sounds really cool. Yeah, so that sort of narrative play or thematic play is something that Tim and I think is really important for Star Wars Unlimited, because there are a lot of people coming into this game who aren't hardcore gamers, and while some of them will absolutely become hardcore gamers and go the competitive route, a fair number won't, and we want to make sure that they feel included. There are people who've read all of the books and all of the comics, and they're not good at games, or they don't really enjoy the competition in games, and they're worried about hyper-competitive players. And so creating opportunities for them to express themselves other than, I won, and my deck is the best because I followed the meta, giving them some other opportunities to express themselves and be a part of the community and influence the community, I think is really great. But with that diatribe out of the way, let's dive into this week's lesson. We're going to be talking about zones. Right. So, we're covering Comprehensive Rules, Section 4, Zones. There are 7 zones, and each zone has its own set of rules that apply to it, much like each type has its own set of rules that apply to it. These determine what cards can go in these zones, how cards behave when they're in the zones, all sorts of goody stuff. There are 7 types of zones. They call out specifically 2 shared zones, which are the ground arena and the space arena. They don't have an official term for the other 5 zones. I've been calling them personal zones. There's maybe some indication that they're separate zones, but that feels weird because each of these zones is separate from the others. Anyways, there's also set aside, which is outside of the game zone, removed from the game in the parlance of other games, or exile in Magic, and I think banish in Flesh and Blood, even though you have access to it. Kalantaris, private zones feels weird because that, to me, indicates that my opponent, it is private knowledge as well. And while the hand and deck are private, the base zone and the discard and resources are semi-private. Discard and base are very public information, and so private feels a little bit weird. I don't know. There's not a great term for it, and there doesn't really need to be, except when I am teaching people about these rules. Like, it has no gameplay impact, generally speaking, what that term means, and everybody understands on an intuitive level, yeah, you and your opponent do not share a deck, you do not share a hand, you do not share a discard pile. Those, it doesn't make sense for those to be the same zone. It could potentially make sense for everything that's in play to be a shared zone, but it doesn't really matter. But the 5 separated or personal or private zones, whatever we end up calling them, are base, resource, deck, hand, and discard. Each player has their own zone of those types. The 2 shared zones are the ground arena and the space arena. Now, with the lessons that I've been doing for level 1, I just open up my comprehensive rules and go through in order. This time we're going to go a bit out of order, saving 4.3 and 4.4, the ground arena and space arena, until I've covered all the other zones. I'm going to do the personal, private, separated zones, and then I'll do the shared zones. And that's what this slide talks about. I am so good at just forgetting that I have this overview slide and not showing it when I'm talking to you during these broadcasts. I'm just very talented. But let's move on to the base zone. Each player has their own base zone. The game begins with bases and leaders in this zone. Bases cannot leave this zone. It would be real weird if they did. and leaders cannot be deployed. Sorry, that's not good words. Leaders can be deployed. That's half the purpose of leaders. Leaders can leave the base zone. They just start there. It's a place you can interact. They are in play in a way. They can be interacted with directly. They can be attacked. Bases can be attacked. Leaders can be used. That sort of thing. I'm distracted by the art on Coronet City, and I have complaints, but we'll get to that at the end of this broadcast if somebody reminds me in about an hour. The Resource Zone. Each player also has their own Resource Zone. All cards in the Resource Zone are resources and can be exhausted to pay costs. Being in the Resource Zone is what defines a card as a resource. Resource isn't a card type, as we've mentioned before in the various types lessons, and so a card becomes a resource by being face down in the Resource Zone. If a card somehow is put into the Resource Zone face down without the instruction of put into play as a resource, it's a resource now. I don't know how you did that. You shouldn't be able to, but that's how we know what a resource is. Resources, of course, can be exhausted to pay costs. You are allowed to look at your resources, and this is considered hidden information. Your opponent does not get access to this. Specifically, when looking at resources, we'll get into this in the next one. Cards are added to the Resource Zone during the resource step, or when instructed to do so. You put them into play as a resource, or put into play as a resource, which means into play face down in the Resource Zone. Cards are considered to have no attributes while a resource. They are still cards in play, but none of the attributes on them are valid. They don't have a cost. They don't have aspect. They don't have a name, etc., etc. Does resources being face down mean we ought to discourage the use of face down cards as representing tokens? I would generally discourage that, yes. Because it is, I think, a little bit too easy. I mean, it leads to an increased chance of a card accidentally entering or leaving the Resource Zone. Ideally, players will have enough tokens from packs. Unlike some other games, there are not a huge number or huge variety of tokens in Star Wars Unlimited. Right now we just have the 4 types, and every pack comes with 1. And so if you open like 10 packs, you should have enough for what you need. And if you don't, somebody else should have some on hand. And if you're playing a deck, you should come with clear tokens. The other reason I discourage using face down cards as tokens is because they're not as clear as cards that have printed text on them. You might forget the cost of units. It's all 0. You might forget the power and toughness. Unlikely. You might forget the traits. Clones are Republic clone troopers, surprisingly, but you might forget one of those traits in the middle of a game, and it's important to have that information available both to you and your opponent, especially as the game grows and more tokens are added. I would generally discourage using face-down cards as tokens, particularly for competitive level play. If you're playing in a game where you have dozens upon dozens of tokens and you just run out and it's a casual level thing, you can use face-down cards. I would say make sure that they are unsleeved and do not match your sleeves or your opponent's sleeves. So if your deck is in red sleeves and you have a bunch of cards in purple sleeves, you can use those as tokens because we're not going to get those confused with your resources. I do have another rant about how I wish we had resource tokens just to indicate what a resource is, and so it says face up, this is a resource, and it's less likely that those change zones because it clearly says this is a resource and not a card that may have fallen off the top of the deck, a card that got flipped over, a card from a hand that was dropped, that sort of thing. But that is a longer conversation. Great. Now, moving on to selecting cards from resources. When a player selects their resources, they may look at them before making that decision. If an effect instructs an opponent to make a choice, the player can rearrange their resources before the effect resolves. So if I play Wrecker, I can look at my resources and decide which one of those to defeat. I don't have to pick one at random. I don't have to rely on my memory. I can pick the one that I want to defeat. If my opponent plays DJ, again, I can say, okay, you have your when played trigger. I'm going to look at my resources real quick and rearrange them. That way you don't have to be constantly rearranging them, and your opponent doesn't really get the opportunity to try and play a shell game with you and try and figure out exactly which one is your smuggle card. Or if you, for example, had just had a Super Laser Technician or some other card that went into play as a resource and they know of it. Enterprising Lackeys is a good one because it's a card that goes into play as a resource and has smuggle built in. Using that knowledge, you know what cards you have. You're allowed to rearrange them as long as they remain grouped together by similar status. So all of your ready resources need to stay together. You can't unready a resource and ready another one to balance it out. All of your ready resources must remain ready. All of your unready resources must remain exhausted. And all of the cards owned by other players must remain in their own separate groups. Yeah, so you're allowed to rearrange. I wish it just said random rather than choose, because that negates this shuffling mechanic, and you just be like, okay, it's resources 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'll roll a d10. Great, that's number 7. But having players be allowed to rearrange their resources also works. Moving on to the deck. Each player has their own deck. The deck is face down and out of play. If you somehow slide your deck into the resource zone, it becomes resources. That's not true. Don't believe me. That was a joke. You can only look at the contents of your deck if you're instructed to do so. You're not allowed to look at your deck and rearrange it just for funsies. This is ideally obvious, but it is also covered in the rules, so nobody's allowed to get away with it. The contents of the deck are hidden information, while the number of cards in the deck is open information. So neither you nor your opponent are guaranteed the information of what's in your deck. If you forget what's in your deck, that's on you. If you forget if you're playing 2 or 3 Rivals Fall on the day, or 2 or 3 takedowns, and you're just like, I can't remember what mix of removal I put into my deck, and I wish I knew what outs I was playing to, that's a you problem, unfortunately. You're not allowed to look at your deck to jog your memory. You can look at your sideboard, but you cannot look at your deck. Cards remain in the deck until they are drawn, discarded, or played from the deck. If one of these events occurs, the card immediately leaves the deck. And so if you have something that, as an additional cost to play a card, you discard the top card of your deck, and you're using Ezra Bridger to play a card from the top of your deck, that card will not then be discarded by that additional cost effect. That effect doesn't exist yet, but I'm sure it will one day in the future. Any questions so far, or are we just blazing through these things? Just the L3 when people can look into their side deck during the game, like between plays. As far as I'm aware, yes. There's nothing restricting you from doing so. You're not allowed to make changes, and you need to keep it very distinct from your hand and deck. But you can absolutely pull up your cards, look at them, and put them back. This can help remind you of what you removed or what you added. Or it's I'm playing game 1 and I'm already thinking about game 2. While my opponent is doing something, I want to take a second to figure out what plays I might or what swaps I'm going to consider for the next game, that sort of thing. But yes, you are allowed to look at, to the best of my understanding, you're allowed to look at your sideboard during a game. You just can't swap any cards or have anything go from one zone to another. Each player has their own hand. Players can look at their hand at any time, and the contents are hidden information. This is true even if the hand was previously revealed. So, for example, if you play Bodhi Rook and look at my hand, you're allowed to write down the names of the cards, and generally a sporting player will allow their opponent the time to look at their cards or will confirm, am I good to pick up my hand now? Have you completed the tasks that you need to complete while my hand is revealed? However, if you look at my hand, you see that all I have are Death Star Stormtroopers. I pick up my hand and you say, hey, it was all Death Star Stormtroopers. I no longer have to answer that because that information is back to being hidden information. Generally, you want to be sporting about this, but it is hidden information. You do not need to provide it once the cards are no longer being revealed. Of course, the number of cards is open information. Kalantaris, are players allowed to play with open hands if they choose to? I think I remember reading something somewhere that says players are not allowed to reveal hidden information, but I think generally, yes, you are. I believe you are allowed to play with your hand up, like just being like, rather than you writing down, I'll just leave these cards here, just draw cards into my hand, and we don't need to deal with the writing down. I think the instruction is you're not allowed to reveal hidden information that you yourself don't have access to, so you can't, like, show your opponent the top card of your deck and be like, look, I'm allowed to reveal hidden information. You're allowed to reveal hidden information that you already have access to, which is your hand. I think you can also, theoretically, following that logic, you would be able to reveal your resources to your opponent if you wanted to. I would want to double-check policy before anybody quotes me on that. But just being like, yeah, I have these things in Smuggle, I will kill you in, like, I have the cards that I need to kill you, is a thing that you can do, I believe. I'd want to double check policy on that before I get quoted. Let me see if I can pull up. There's nothing in the tournament docs about that, so it's gonna be in section 1 in hidden information. We're flipping through pages. There's nothing that explicitly states that players yeah. There's not a ton about hidden information because it's just not really in the tournament regulations right now. But yeah, you should be able to reveal your resources or your hand if you're just like, yeah, I have these cards, I have you dead, unless you have the specific counter card, or I have you dead even if you have the counter card because you only have 2 cards in hand and you can't kill all of my things. Yes, you cannot be like, here's the cards, I want a match result. You cannot reveal the cards out of your hand for that. And Gentle Giant, yeah, I have a printed copy of the older set of comprehensive rules. My printer has gone on the fritz since I've printed them out. I need to bring it to a repair shop. But having a printed set of comprehensive rules has been very helpful for me, just in, like, writing lessons or, like, reading it before bedtime as, like, a bedtime story, because it's just nicer on my eyes than looking at my tiny little phone screen. Now, the number of cards in a player's hand is open information, as we've discussed. Cards remain in hand until played or discarded. This happens as soon as the instruction occurs. So, if, for example, a player plays Cunning and chooses the first mode to resolve first, and they return a unit 4 or less to its owner's hand, that happens, and then we choose the next effect. If we choose the discard, that card is in the hand and can be immediately discarded. Similarly, if we had an effect that says a player discards a card from their hand, then plays a card from their hand, the card will be discarded before the card can be chosen for playing. Curse Strife says, for a casual friendly game, I don't think there's anything that says you cannot play with an open hand. For teaching someone new to the game, I would actually recommend open hands at first. I strongly agree with that. I always play with open hands against new players, so that at the very least I can explain my strategic thinking, and I offer them the opportunity to play with open hands. Some players who are a bit more competitive will be like, no, I want to preserve my information. But most of the time they're like, I have no idea what I'm doing, please give me some advice, and they'll show off cards in their hand. I think you can even do this for competitive games. If you're like locked for top 8, or if you're at the bottom of the standings and you're locked for no prizes whatsoever, and you're just having fun, you're just like, hey, I play this Boba Sabine matchup a lot. Do you want to play hands up? Because that way, like, we can explain our lines of thinking to each other, and we can both learn this matchup better, because clearly at the 0-4 bracket where I live, we are not doing well and can learn the strategy better. So understanding what your thought process is and what my thought process is, maybe one of us gets better at this game. And that's something that you can do even at a competitive event, is my understanding. Each player has their own discard pile as we move on. Events, defeated non-leader units, resources, upgrades, and discarded cards are placed face up into the discard pile. It is an unordered zone, which means that you can absolutely pull cards off to the side if you're thinking about Rogue Squadron Skirmisher, or Home 1, or Palpatine's Return, anything like that that cares about cards in your discard pile. If you're playing, I think it's Bounty Hunter Crew, you can set aside all of your Underworld cards, or not your Underworld cards, your event cards, for the Street Rat or whatever it is that cares about Underworld cards. You could set aside all of your Underworld cards. You can even have 2, 3, 4 piles, as long as it isn't too messy. And being clear about what you're doing is important. But just saying, yeah, I'm just sorting out my graveyard. You don't actually have to explain to your opponent what you're doing. As long as you're like, these are all still in my discard, that's fine. You don't have to say, oh yeah, I'm sorting them out for Rogue Squadron Skirmisher, which I have in my deck, but you haven't seen yet. You do not need to provide that information. For something like Cobb Vanth, if you just want to put the card that has that effect off to the side, or turn it to 90 degrees so it's very visible to you as a reminder, you're absolutely allowed to do that as well. I think it is extraordinarily unlikely we'll get any Discard Order Matters cards. I know that they used to exist in Magic the Gathering. They have not printed any in over 20 years. And they are such a pain in the butt. And there are some formats where you do care about the discard order. And there are some decks in those formats where they put their entire deck into their discard pile. And nobody's playing any of the cards that care. But you still gotta do it. Just in case somebody maybe, perhaps, 1% chance is. They're not. But you gotta keep them in order. Anyways. Yes, the main reason you wouldn't want to reorder the discard piles, it can help reconstruct the events if there's a dispute. This is why I would generally recommend, rather than pulling cards out, just rotating them 90 degrees so they're visible and distinct from the rest of the pile, but they're still sequenced appropriately. Even without them being sequenced appropriate, it's possible to reconstruct stuff. You just have to ask a few more questions. Alrighty, the ground and space arena. Both players share the ground and space arena. All units in the ground arena are in the same arena. All units in the space arena are in the same arena. It's everything in the same place. So something like Bombing Run will hit all units, both friendly and enemy, in either the space arena or the ground arena, depending on where it goes. Layout is determined each game by the first unit played. The ground arena will, if it's on your right, will be on your opponent's left, and vice versa. And those arenas stay true throughout the game. You're not allowed to switch them back and forth, although it's perfectly fine if you accidentally do. like if you super laser blast and then play a ground arena, and you are used to playing your ground units to the right, and this game you've been playing them to the left, and you play it to the right, and you're just like, whoops, played to the right, and your opponent's like, oh yeah, I'm going to play my ground unit to that side of the board as well. That's fine as long as everybody is clear. Now, units can only attack enemy units in their arena or an enemy base, unless they're strafing gunship or you're using swoop down. However, units can damage units in other arenas. Admiral Akbar's one Plague Trigger can deal damage to either a ground unit or a space unit. With Strike True, you can have any unit deal damage to any other unit. One of the weird things about these cards, this is not about zones at all. This is about Lurking TIE Phantom, because Lurking TIE Phantom pops up anywhere and everywhere. So, the event is causing the damage, and so Lurking TIE Phantom's effect prevents the damage. However, the unit is still itself dealing that damage, which I don't... It only comes up with, I believe, Jango Fett in set 3. I don't think there are any other cards that say when this unit deals damage, period. I think they all say when this unit deals combat damage. I may be misremembering. But with Strike True or Overwhelming Barrage, a unit will deal damage, even if it is the event ability that is causing the damage. So Lurking TIE Phantom will prevent the damage or cause the damage not to occur through its ability, because it's being caused by an event ability, even though the damage itself is being dealt by a unit. It's very weird, not the most intuitive. Lurking TIE Phantom continues to do Lurking TIE Phantom things. Any questions on that? Because there's a very good chance that there might be. I'll give y'all a couple seconds to think that, drink some water, because good lord, my voice is gone. Kalantari says, I wish TIE Phantom had said prevent non-combat damage. That would have been great. Yeah, that would have been good wording. Yeah, there's a lot of weird exceptions to Lurking TIE Phantom, and like half of the L1 test, roughly half the L1 test, is just going to be like a picture of Lurking TIE Phantom and a bunch of question marks, and it's just going to be open response, and you'll write whatever you want about Lurking TIE Phantom and Crate Dragon and like DJ, and it'll just be like, you just say words, and we'll figure out if you know what you're talking about. That's not what the L1 test is going to be. I do not have the time to evaluate thousands of open response answers. Alrighty. Moving on to in play and out of play. The ground arena, space arena, base, and resource zones are all in play. Hand, deck, and discard are all out of play. Abilities and effects only affect cards that are in play unless they specify otherwise. For example, Waylay says return a non-leader unit to its owner's hand. You cannot use this to return a unit that has been defeated and is in your discard pile to your hand, even though it doesn't specify return a non-leader unit in play or a non-leader unit in the ground arena or space arena to its owner's hand. It does that by default because cards affect only the in-play areas and are only active while in play. General Dodonna, his ability, while it is public information while he's in the discard pile, does not apply to cards in play while he's in the discard pile. Similarly, if he is in play, it's not going to apply to cards in your discard pile, so if you have an effect that cares about the power or HP of a unit in your discard pile, that +1/+1 doesn't apply to units in your discard pile. Similarly, we have the play area. A player's play area is cards they control in play. This is a term that's used mostly within the comprehensive rules and not by any cards themselves. A play area is your resource zone, your base zone, and your side of the ground and space arena. It's anything you control in play except for upgrades played onto enemy units, because they're in your opponent's play area, which is their ground and space arena. Nilram asks, can't remember offhand, two negative traits, i.e. giving an event that gives Lurking Tie -2/-2 work. Kalantari says yes, and I concur. In that case, it is not the event that is defeating Lurking Tie Phantom, but the game rules. It's weird, because, like, it's also damage. Like, the reason damage kills Lurking Tie Phantom is the game rules, but it's different enough that the designer is saying -X does apply, damage does not. It's... oh, we love it. But there's no limit on the number of cards a player can control in their play area. This is going to become particularly relevant with clone troopers and battle droids. It seems like people are going to be able to churn out a lot of our token friends. You can have any number of resources, any number of cards in your hand. The only limitation is the number of cards your deck can produce. At some point, you're going to run out of cards in your deck, and at that point, well, you're probably not going to be adding too many more units to the ground or Space Arena. Set Aside is another mechanic or term that is used relatively sparingly. Set Aside means it is out of play, not in any zone, not in any player's play area, and not controlled by any player. It is not a part of the game. However, cards that are set aside can be accessed by the game because tokens are pulled from the set aside area into the game. And I think there's one or two judge penalties where sometimes you'll set something aside, at least as written. But generally, cards that are set aside are going to be entirely out of the game. Kalantari says, did you know you were going to be in charge of the judge program when Lurking Tie was spoiled, and did it make me happy? I did not. We had not confirmed the contract at that point in time. However, things were moving in that direction, and frankly, yes, it did make me happy. It made me very happy. One of the challenges that I've faced with Star Wars Unlimited is that the designers have done an incredible job making the game very intuitive. 90% of the interactions are relatively straightforward and obvious, which means that coming up with good questions for judges that test their knowledge of the fundamentals of rules and policy can be a little bit tricky. And so having cards like Krayt Dragon, Lurking Tie Phantom, and DJ and Tech, where players are like, I have 2 million questions about this card, means that there's an area where judges can provide a lot of value. And that actually is genuinely exciting to me. We're going to transition back to me while I open up the next little presentation. Tennessee Feet Monk says, on Set Aside, which zone is a captured card in? Rules as written says it is considered out of play, but Rescue says return it to play. And those two rules contradict each other. So they are in play, but treated as though they are out of play. It's weird. They don't want them to be set aside out of play, and not in any zone. They want them to be still a part of the game, because they are part of the game. And if they are not part of the game, if they are set aside or out of play, the rules regarding information don't apply to them. And so it is... they are in the... I believe they are in the capturing unit zone. Just face down with no attributes, which is a little weird. And hopefully no resources ever learn how to capture stuff, because that gets real wonky real fast. But because players are entitled to the information of the card, all of its attributes, they need to be in play so that players have access to them, because if they were set aside or out of play, you could just take the card and put it in your deck box, because that's what out of play entails. And so we explicitly don't do that. And so they're still technically in play, but it's real weird. And so they don't want you to be able to interact with them. They don't want you to, for example, to be able to waylay them and return the captured unit to your own hand and play with them, and so they have to be considered out of play and set aside. I do not have an answer to the question of are tokens completely removed when captured question. Hopefully that'll be in the Set 3 update that will be coming before Set 3 releases. Alrighty. Oh no. Technology, are you doing things? Let's check my transitions. Alrighty. We should be good to hop. Unless anybody has any questions on zones, I think we're going to hop right into game structure. I'll give you a little bit of time. But other than that, we'll just move back to game structure. Or move on to game structure, rather. And we're going to do the clock transition. We love that transition. I have a lot of fun with these transitions, getting that Star Wars vibe from them. Alrighty. Game structure. Let's go. This one has some terms, and we're going to just start explaining these terms right at the top of the lesson. A tournament round consists of matches. Matches consist of games. Game consists of game rounds. Game rounds consist of phases. Phases consist of step, and each step must be completed in full. And there we have our good friend, the Phase 3 Dark Trooper. See, it says phase on it. It's a joke. Anyways, there is more to it than this very brief overview. While it's true that a game does consist of rounds, each round has the action phase and the regroup phase, which have steps within them. The action phase is where players take actions going back and forth. And the regroup phase is where the game runs a bit of maintenance. Players draw cards, put them into play as resources, and ready their cards so they can go for another action phase. No Breaks 58 groans at the dad joke. You know what? I'm not sorry. When I don't have a card that I'm referencing mechanically, I'm always going to come up with something that either generally fits mechanically, or if I can get a pun in there, I 100% will. It's a little bit harder with Star Wars Unlimited because I only have like 500 cards to play with. When I make lessons for Magic the Gathering, they have like 25,000 cards, and there's just so many good puns that I can do. It's great. I might have to bring in some Magic cards for some lessons if I need a particular pun, because they have a lot of good options for me. So let's dive in. We're going to start, of course, with game setup. Before we get to the actual playing of the game, we need to go through the steps of setting up for the game. Whoop, we went too far too fast. Nilram54 says tokens. If a token would move to an out-of-play zone for any reason, set it aside instead. It is still considered to have left play. The question there is, when captured, it doesn't actually move out of play. It is simply considered out of play. And so the question is, does that rule apply? And it's unclear, I think. And I believe we're going to be getting some clarification on that, because we haven't had token units yet, and so it hasn't mattered, right? Like, you're not able... I don't believe... Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's anything that allows you to capture an upgrade. And the considered out of play... Okay, is it actually out of play, or is it not out of play? Who knows? I would venture to guess that tokens vanish into the ether if they're captured. But that is a whole guess. But setting up the game. 1, you put bases into play. 2, you put leaders into play. 3, you determine the first player. The first 2 steps can happen in any order. You can put your leader into play, then your base. You can do your base, then your leader. But after that, players are gaining information and making choices, and so you're no longer able to go willy-nilly in whatever order you want. Players are entitled to the information of what deck their opponent is playing when they decide who starts with the initiative, because many decks or some decks, Cad Bane in particular, and I think a couple others, prefer to go second against some decks and sometimes prefer to start with the initiative, and so you get to know what you're playing against. Then you shuffle decks and draw opening hands and make mulligan decisions. And again, you get to know which player is going first when you make these mulligan decisions. So that means if you're playing something that cares about either countering your opponent's turn 1 play or making your own aggressive turn 1 play if you're going first, you get to have that information when making this decision. You make a mulligan. If you make a mulligan, you only get the 1 mulligan. The cards get shuffled back into the deck. They're not set aside, so you have a chance of theoretically redrawing the exact same 6 cards. And then you resource 2 cards. Kalantaris asks, the first player decides whether to mulligan first. Yes, if there's any sort of disagreement or one player's like, hey, I want to see what my opponent's doing before whether or not I mulligan, they make that decision first. If the non-active player decides to mulligan, they just look at their hand and they're like, everything in here costs 20 resources, I'm putting them back. The active player is not locked into keeping their hand. They are still able to make that decision, albeit they get the opportunity to make that decision with more information than they normally would. You're not able to rush your opponent through a decision with mulligan decisions, or similarly, as we'll get to later in the game, with resourcing. While there is an order, you can do it a little bit out of order. You can volunteer to go first. And so if you announce your decision before your opponent has announced any decision, that is you giving up information, essentially. The information about mulligan decisions matters a little bit less in Star Wars Unlimited than it does in other games where you reduce the number of cards you have in your opening hand, although it does let your opponent know that you weren't happy with your hand, and that gives them a spark of hope. And then the final step is resource 2 cards. You have to resource exactly 2 cards. You cannot resource 0 or 1 or 3. It must be exactly 2. And so you start with 4 cards in hand and 2 ready resources. These 2 cards that you put into play as resources are ready, which is a change of pace from every other resource in the game, unless it has explicit text that says then ready it. Alrighty. The round. Every round has 2 phases, the action phase and the regroup phase. The start of the action phase is the start of a new round, and this round applies to both phases. So if you play No Good to Me Dead, it applies to the action phase and the regroup phase. If you were to somehow play No Good to Me Dead during your regroup phase, I'm not sure how you would. I don't think any cards let you play events during the regroup phase at this point in time, but if you did, its effect would end at the end of the regroup phase. It's not a regroup phase and an action phase, it is this round. Alrighty. So, the action phase. At the start or end of any phase, 3 things occur in sequence. First, any lasting effects expire. This is something like, give a friendly unit +3/+3 for this phase, or it gains Sentinel for this phase. Then, delayed effects, then triggered abilities. Lasting effects have a set duration after which they end. So this phase, this round, for this attack, while you're playing this card, it is an effect that lasts for a duration and then ends, and it ends as soon as that duration is up. Nothing else sees it. The next thing that if multiple lasting effects have the same end condition, they end simultaneously. So while they are ending, whatever unit is affected or card is affected by them will not be under the effect of just one while the effects are expiring. If you played Tactical Advantage on card and then your opponent played Make an Opening, or the other way around, and then it took damage so that the Make an Opening would kill it if Tactical Advantage wasn't around, they wear off at the same time. It's not like if you played Tactical Advantage first, it wears off first. They wear off simultaneously. The delayed effects. Delayed effects are set up by the resolution of a previous ability. So while lasting effects say, during this time period, something is happening, a delayed effect says, in the future, something will happen. Tennessee Feet Monk says, can you explain where it says delayed effects occur between lasting and triggers? I can't find that specified anywhere. Yes, let me just throw my pen on the floor in frustration with my comprehensive rules. I just had it on top of my comprehensive rules. You have to look in a couple places to get this. Delayed effects resolve. So this is, oh gosh, where are we? We are in section 7.7.4. Yeah, 7.7.4b. Delayed effects resolve automatically and immediately after their specified timing point or future condition occurs before any other abilities triggered by that timing point or condition. And so that has delayed effects occurring before triggered abilities. Then we have, if we dive into game structure in section 5, really any game structure section, it'll say start of the regroup phase, any lasting effects that expire when the regroup phase starts expire now. Any abilities or effects that trigger at the start of the regroup phase or appropriate phase trigger now. And so that has effects that lasting effects expire before effects trigger. This is, I think, not super, like, you have to look at a couple of different points in the CR to put this together. This is not the most intuitive part of the rules. Theoretically, there's nothing that says delayed effects occur after lasting effects, and so it could go delayed effects, lasting effects triggered. However, I don't believe that's the intention of the designers. Curse Strife says, not the most intuitive equals watch out for it on a test. Yep, 100%. So with lasting effects, they expire as soon as we get to that phase or that round or whatever event is occurring. Like, whenever that duration ends, that stops. Delayed effects require a player choice, and so the lasting effect, like, if we have something that says at the, so Triple Dark Raid, which we have up on the screen right now, says return to its owner's hand at the end of the phase, right? We are taking an action, and that takes, my perception of this is that takes a non-zero amount of time, whereas a lasting effect, like, at the end of the phase, take an action. You are doing something, and that requires, I don't know, time, whereas the lasting effect is already over. The lasting effect ends immediately, whereas an action or doing something happens. Curse Strife, oh, I love that. Lasting equals happen until a point, delayed equals happens at a point, and triggered equals happened because of a point or after a point. Delayed effects are set up by the resolution of a previous ability. And yeah, I think that's a very good way of explaining it, Curse Strife. I'm going to steal that and put that somewhere. I'm just going to copy that. Don't worry, it's fine. That's actually really good. We're just going to copy and paste that and put that in the lesson. I think that's just such a clean way of explaining it. So yeah, I hope that explains that. It is not explicit in the rules, and you do have to piece a couple things together to get there, but I believe it is included in the rules. I have made a note that I'm going to be sending to Ryan, who's the rules admiral, saying, hey, this isn't super clear. Me reading the entire 50 pages cover to cover with an eye towards teaching it to judges and knowing they'll ask me questions like this means that I caught it. But I think that most people will not catch it. And we want the rules to be as intuitive as possible. Now, finally, so we have delayed effects. They're set up by the resolution of a previous ability, and they include at the start of or at the end of, and require an action or choice. This is different from lasting effects, which simply expire and no choice is required. Triggered abilities trigger when a phase begins or ends. These include when the phase starts, when the phase ends, and also require an action or choice, like delayed effects, but were not set up by the resolution of a previous ability. These are new things. So, why does this matter? I want to thank our judge apprentices. This is something that some folks brought up, but I had an example where we were looking at a couple different, like, lasting effects, delayed effects, and triggered abilities. And it was like, okay, sure, you can sequence these, but they don't really interact with each other. So what's a situation where the sequence of these abilities and effects actually matters? And some judge apprentices came up with something brilliant. As Gentle Giant 303 says, say something smart equals Jonah goes yoink. That is true. I borrowed this example from our judge apprentices, and I would like to credit them for this. So, active player plays Sneak Attack, playing Inferno 4. We go to the end of the phase. Lasting effects, none apply. We don't have to worry about that. We have the delayed effect. Sneak Attack defeats Inferno 4. Inferno 4's when defeated ability triggers and resolves. The active player gets to look at the top 2 cards of their deck, put any number of them on the bottom of the deck and the rest on top in any order, and then the phase trigger, Dr. Aphra's ability, triggers and resolves. If it was the other way around, or if they were simultaneous, the player would be able to choose which order things went in. If it was the other way around, they would discard a card from their deck and then resolve the Inferno 4 when defeated trigger. But the way the comprehensive rules are written, the delayed effects will always trigger before the phase triggers. So, this is an example where this sequencing actually matters. I am confident that as the game grows, there will be more and more examples of these, and I'm sure within the year, we're going to have an example that has a lasting effect, a delayed effect, and a phase trigger, where all of them matter. And it might even see tournament play. I'm not going to put money on it seeing tournament play. I'm not going to put money on having all 3 either, because I'm not a gambling guy, but we'll see. Alrighty. So we've been talking about the action phase this entire time, and what we've really been talking about is the start of the action phase. Also, coincidentally, the end of the action phase, the start of the regroup phase, and the end of the regroup phase, so we're really talking about 4 different steps, but they all function the same. They're all lasting effects, delayed effects, triggered abilities. The rest of the action phase, however, is players actually taking turns, playing stuff. You can alternate taking turns, you play a card, attack with a unit, use an action ability, pass, or take the initiative. As always, we're not going to cover those in this lesson, we're going to cover them in the next lesson. Yep, that's the next lesson in the comprehensive rules. You're able to take any of these actions, other than take the initiative, as many times as you would like during a round. And you can take the same one multiple times. You don't have to take all of the actions in a given round. It's totally up to you. Once both players pass, the step ends. If one player has taken the initiative and the next player passes, or one player passes and the other player takes the initiative, that also counts as both players passing. As noted here, passing and taking the initiative, if you're interested in details, covered in more detail in Level 1, Lesson 3. Play a card, attack with a unit, and use an action ability will be covered in Level 1, Lesson 8, which comes out on Thursday. Alrighty. Oh, you reckon Given to Your Anger does interesting things here. I don't remember what Given does, but I'm curious. Yes. Given to Your Anger does do interesting things here. So, for those who aren't aware of Given to Your Anger off the top of your head, deal 1 damage to an enemy unit. Its controller's next action this phase must be an attack with that unit if able. It must attack a unit if able. If a player has taken the initiative, they cannot take an action, and so they will continue to pass. I don't know if there are any other cards that force a player to take an action. It would be very interesting if, like, you have a card that is that, like, as an additional cost, the next action you take this phase must be pass. And if you're instructed to do 2 different things at the same time, I don't know what would happen. I am sure that in the future this may gain the infamy of Lurking TIE Phantom, and I'm very excited to see what happens with that in the future. But the regroup phase. So we have the start of phase, which has lasting effects, delayed effects, triggered abilities. Then we have the draw step. Each player draws 2 cards. They must draw exactly 2 cards. They're not allowed to draw fewer cards. They're not allowed to draw more cards. If a player has an empty deck and they're trying to draw a card from it, they take 3 damage from each card that they attempted to draw and failed to draw. These card draws and damage is all simultaneous. So if I'm at 2 life and my opponent's at 6, but neither of us have any cards in our deck, we both try to draw 2 cards, we both take 6 damage, and we are both defeated simultaneously. It does not matter that, like, if we were drawing them sequentially, I would draw 1, take the damage, and die. Or if we were drawing them in active player, non-active player turn order, that would have a different effect. But nope, it's just straight up simultaneous. We'll both draw 2 cards, we'll both take the damage, and we'll both die at the same time, which causes the game to be a draw. In a best of 3, essentially that doesn't matter. It's a wash, it doesn't count. You're looking for 2 wins, not who has the best record after 3 games. Then we have the resource step. Each player resources up to 1 card from their hand. It is not required. This resource does come into play exhausted, unlike the ones that are resourced during the game setup. And then each player readies all resources and units they control. This will, of course, immediately ready the resource that they just played. And then we have the end of phase with lasting effects, then delayed effects, then triggered abilities. And that brings us to the end of the game. The game continues until a player's base is defeated, going through round after round after round. That nomenclature is burned into my brain, and it is not correct. If a player's base is defeated, that player loses immediately. They cannot resolve any abilities or effects. The example that we have here, active player has 2 remaining HP on their base, and their opponent has 3 remaining HP on theirs. The active player plays Mercenary Company, ambushing their opponent's OOM series officer. It deals 1 damage to the officer and 3 damage to the opponent's base, defeating both of them. The non-active player, who controls the droid, does not get the opportunity to deal 2 damage to the active player because they are defeated before they're able to resolve that trigger. Finally, a player can concede at any time, and doing so causes them to lose the game immediately. If you're playing best of 3 and know you're going to lose the game, you can concede... I'll get to that question in a second. If you're playing in a best of 3 and know you're going to lose the game, you can concede when your opponent plays a Viper probe droid before they're allowed to see your hand and preserve some information. So if you're playing game 1, or maybe you're playing game 2 and you have some spicy sideboard tech that you brought in that you don't want them to see, and they play a Viper probe droid or a Bodhi Rook or something else that allows them to look at your hand, or maybe even something that allows them to look at your deck or resources at some point in the future, you can say, I concede. However, you cannot concede to avoid an infraction or penalty. If a player commits an error, while they're allowed to concede the game, the infraction and penalty will still be recorded and issued. This is particularly important. Some players will just be like, I feel bad about the mistake that I made, and I don't want to burden you, the judge, with fixing this, so players will offer to concede. However, you will still issue that penalty because it's important to track it in case it's a habit. And the concern is if a player has malicious intent and they concede whenever they are caught, they can hide some amount of their malicious actions, some of their cheats, by conceding, and we don't want them to do that. Now, notably, the vast, vast, vast majority of players who concede when they commit an error are not cheating. They are just players who are embarrassed that they made a silly, stupid mistake and are embarrassed and do not want to be the subject of any more scrutiny because they feel bad. And going to the question from Kalantarius, is there a reason why Final Showdown says you lose the game instead of destroy your base? Would it make a difference or defeat your base? I agree with what Curstrife says, which is probably to avoid rules issues down the line. There might be cards in the future that prevent damage to a base or prevent it from being destroyed for a round. I think that's correct. Right now there isn't anything in the game that says defeat a base, because oh boy, that would be pretty strong. But simply saying you lose the game makes it there's one fewer hoop to jump through rules-wise. See also Lurking TIE Phantom and jumping through hoops. Fantastic. That brings us to the end of this lesson. Our next scheduled lesson will cover action timing and clarification. And that's all we have for today. I'm going to hang out for a couple more minutes. If any of you have any questions, please feel free to hit me up. Happy to chat for a little bit longer. Just over an hour for 2 lessons isn't too bad. As always, it's a pleasure chatting with you all. You all bring great questions. I love the energy and enthusiasm you all bring. I will be doing a broadcast this Thursday, next Tuesday, and then the next 3 weeks. I'm going to be traveling again and again and again, and so we're not going to have a ton more of Thursday broadcasts for... I think we'll have one like the last week in October, right before the L1 test is scheduled to go live. I think I might try and put together an extra long broadcast to sort of do like a study session of sorts. I'm not sure how I can facilitate that without just like straight up, like if I, the person who wrote the test, run that and say, hey, you should really understand how this works. That's maybe a little bit too much, but that's something that I would like to facilitate. But other than that, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I'll hang out for another couple minutes. For all of you thanking me, absolutely my pleasure. I love doing this. I love chatting with all of you. I'm glad that this is a resource that is useful to many of you, and I hope that we continue to be able to do this in the future. Something that I'm planning on doing this week, if I have the time for it, is putting out a broad survey to folks in the Discord, figuring out what is a good time for the broadcast. Right now I'm switching between my noon and my midnight, just to try and get a broader sweep of the planet's demographics, because we're an international organization and I don't just want to hit the folks who are available at this time when I'm not at my peak energy right now, but in the middle of my day. And so I'm going to ask what time zone people live in and what times are good for their broadcasts. It may be, given the amount of travel that I do, particularly for the next 2 months, given that over the course of like 8 weeks, I think I'll actually be here for like 2 Fridays when I do the like broadcast for the Thursday lessons. It might just be easier to always do double up broadcasts on Tuesdays because I'm here for all of those. It's just that when I travel for a weekend event, I'm not going to be here on Friday because I'm going to be busy traveling. And so to make it more consistent, I may just do double up lessons on Tuesdays, find a good time slot that fits for as many people as possible. In an ideal world, I have a bunch of people who are doing these with me, and so we can rotate like from 6 a.m., midnight, 6 p.m., noon, and just go through and get as many hours as possible, but always open to feedback on that front. With all that, it doesn't look like any more questions are coming in, so good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Hope the rest of your day is good, or hope you sleep well if that's where you're going next. Have a good one, and I'll see you on Friday, that one.